For the first time in 20 years, gun violence is getting worse. Can we stop gun violence without more gun control? And without being called racist? Welcome to America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. 2020 was a terrible year for everything, including gun violence. In fact, it was the deadliest gun violence year in decades. In 2020, gun violence killed nearly 20,000 Americans, more than any other year in at least 2 decades. That may come as a surprise to you, because there were no highly publicized mass shootings in 2020, which is part of the problem. I'll explain in a minute. By the way, those gun violence statistics don't include the additional 24,000 people who died last year by suicide with a gun. Like I've mentioned in previous episodes, most gun deaths in the US are suicides, but many people don't know that. But here's some good news. Overall, violent crime in the US has dropped dramatically in the last 30 years. Why did crime levels drop? Well, it's simple. We have no idea. Okay, we have a lot of theories, from more plausible ones like lower levels of drug use to more out there ones like lower levels of lead in gasoline. Yes, unleaded gasoline. Not the hero we wanted, but the hero we deserve. But today, we're not going to talk about gas. We're going to talk about community violence intervention programs. I asked on a recent episode about whether you wanted to hear more about them, and many of you said yes. Numerous studies show that these programs work to reduce gun violence, but most people probably don't know about them. Instead, when we talk about gun violence in America, the debate immediately becomes about gun control, specifically passing stricter gun control laws, or in President Biden's case, stricter gun control executive actions. I did an episode about Biden's gun control actions, which you should check out. Look, no one is in favor of gun violence. Okay, almost no one is in favor of gun violence. But when we talk about gun violence in America, it immediately becomes a partisan political fight. Democrats talk about gun control, Republicans talk about the Second Amendment, the NRA gets involved, and now gun control is actually about which political party will get hurt in the midterm elections. Only one more year until the next US election. I can't wait. It's just like Christmas, except all of your presents are soaked in unleaded gasoline and then set on fire. Anyway, in addition to the partisan fighting, it's also unclear if commonly debated gun control laws will actually meaningfully reduce gun violence. The assault rifle bans and universal background checks, reflexively supported by progressives, will do little to decrease the bulk of shooting incidents, suicides, and community violence. And that's coming from The Guardian, a progressive newspaper. So instead of only fighting over gun control laws, why don't we also talk about other ways to reduce gun violence that have stronger evidence of working, like community violence prevention programs? Well, there are several highly uncomfortable reasons we don't talk about them, which I'll get to after the break. Welcome back, unless you didn't see an ad because YouTube demonetized this episode, which definitely happened because we're talking about gun violence. Hey, did you know that you can support America Uncovered for as little as $1 an episode on the crowdfunding website Patreon? We literally can't do this show without your support. So why isn't there more national attention on community violence prevention programs? One big reason is that these programs don't stop mass shootings. I'm talking about the type of mass shootings that the national news media focus on, like the ones that happened this year in Boulder and Atlanta. These shootings are, of course, tragic and disturbing, but the wall-to-wall media coverage of them distorts our perception of gun violence in the U.S. Between less than 1% and 3% of America's gun homicide victims die in what we generally consider mass shootings. So where does most gun violence occur? The truth is that interpersonal gun violence in America is driven largely by day-to-day shootings that occur disproportionately in underserved communities of color. And here's the uncomfortable part. These incidents often involve young men and teenagers of color shooting other young men and teenagers of color. And it especially affects the black community. Black men constitute just 6% of the U.S. population and account for more than 50% of all gun homicides each year. For young black men, the murder rate is nearly 20 times the national average. But talking about this issue can be challenging. For example, even saying a lot of this gun violence involves young men of color shooting each other sounds like you're talking about black-on-black crime, which is a loaded and controversial phrase. Now, that phrase has been used by black community leaders, but it's also been called offensive and racist because it demeans black people as criminally inclined. But if talking about gun violence in the black community is racist, not talking about it is also racist. Welcome to American political discourse. It's like drinking unleaded gasoline. So let's talk about some of these community violence intervention programs. One of the most widely used is called group violence intervention. It's sometimes also called focused deterrence. It's made up of a working partnership between respected and credible community members, faith leaders, social service providers, researchers, and law enforcement officials. Group violence intervention is based on the insight that, in city after city, an incredibly small and readily identifiable segment of a given community is responsible for the vast majority of gun violence. How small a group? Here's one example. Richmond, California is a city of about 100,000 people in the San Francisco Bay Area. In 2009, less than 30 men were responsible for 70% of Richmond's gun crime. At the time, Richmond was ranked among the top 12 most dangerous cities in America. Group violence intervention reaches out directly to individuals most likely to commit gun crimes. They do it with in-person meetings with police, social services, faith leaders, and other community activists. These community leaders make it clear to these people that if they stop the violence, the community will help them turn their life around. But if they don't, then there will be harsh law enforcement attention at the request of the community. In other words, the community and the police are working together to prevent future gun violence. The first group violence intervention program was called Operation Ceasefire. It was started in Boston in 1996 by Boston police, black ministers, and academics. And after the youth homicide rate fell by 63%, it became known as the Boston Miracle. Other cities have also had success, including Stockton, Indianapolis, and Lowell, Massachusetts. It also worked in Chicago, Cincinnati, New Haven, and New Orleans. In fact, in a review of more than 1,400 studies on community violence prevention strategies, focused deterrence had the strongest and most consistent anti-violence effects. A similar strategy is used by hospital-based violence intervention programs. Like focused deterrence, these programs offer community support and social services for high-risk individuals. But these programs target people who are in the hospital with a serious violent injury. It's based around the idea that lying in a hospital with a gunshot wound is a good time to reevaluate your life choices. Yes, it is. The first hospital intervention program was developed in 1993 by a nonprofit called Youth Alive. It focused on stopping young victims of violence from retaliating against their attackers and helping them on a path towards safety and healing. A study of the program found that not only did it reduce future criminal involvement, it also saved up to $1.5 million a year in juvenile detention center costs. And then there's street outreach programs. A notable example is Cure Violence. They treat violence like it's an actual disease epidemic, which cuts a little close this year. But one of their innovative ideas is using violence interrupters, people who are trained to prevent shootings by identifying and mediating conflicts in the community. Cure Violence also helps the highest risk individuals with mentoring and social services. A study of a cure violence program in the South Bronx showed a significant decline in gun violence. Although these programs all use different intervention strategies, they all have some things in common, like working within the community, partnering with law enforcement, and providing people at risk of gun violence with help and support. But while there's strong evidence for the effectiveness of these community violence intervention programs, that doesn't mean they always succeed. I'll tell you why after the break. Welcome back. So data shows these violence intervention programs can work, if they have the proper resources. But the two biggest barriers to implementing more of these programs in cities across the U.S. are politics and money. During the Obama administration, a White House staffer told ministers working on these violence intervention programs that there was no political will in the country to address inner-city violence. Instead, in the wake of the Sandy Hook school shooting, the Obama administration rolled out a plan to fight gun violence that focused on stricter gun control laws and $150 million in funding for more school security. Another problem for these violence intervention programs is that they don't fit neatly into U.S. left versus right politics. According to one Harvard researcher, progressives want more prevention and conservatives want more enforcement. Focused deterrence challenges the orthodoxy on both sides. It makes everybody uncomfortable. Speaking of making everybody uncomfortable, group violence intervention programs also require community leaders to work closely with law enforcement, something that's hard when there's distrust on both sides. So it can be tough on a local political level as well. And unfortunately, when things don't fit into neat political boxes, it can be hard to get support and funding. And the lack of funding, political buy-in, and ongoing trust have led cities to abandon these community violence intervention programs. Demand for federal grants far outstrips the available funding. In 2012, 140 programs applied for Justice Department funding, but only 15 got money. Some states and cities, as well as private foundations, have provided funding for these programs as well, but it's still not enough. To President Biden's credit, his new gun control executive orders include directions to federal agencies to make more funding available to community violence intervention programs. And his American Jobs Plan includes $5 billion in funding for community violence intervention programs that include job training. Of course, that plan still has to go through Congress, so it's not clear whether any of that funding will ever happen. But even if these programs can get more federal funding, they still don't have enough political support. For example, the most prominent anti-gun violence groups are more focused on passing stricter gun control laws than on these intervention programs. Part of the problem may be that most Americans don't even know these programs exist. It's hard to support something if you've never heard of it. But the lack of these programs during the coronavirus lockdowns could be one reason for the rise in gun violence last year. Or maybe it's just a lack of unleaded gasoline. So what can you do to help? Share this episode with your friends. Post it on social media. When everyone else is screaming about gun control, community violence intervention programs are a great way to direct the conversation towards something that's proven to work. So what do you think? Leave your comments below. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching America Uncovered.